Kahirlach, ladies and gentlemen, the Honorary Consul from Azerbaijan, ladies and gentlemen, Chairman of the Irish Thalidomide Association, Finola Cassidy, my sister. I heard in the first talk this morning the great Roscommon woman, Maeve, Queen Maeve. I'd like to pay credit to my sister Finola, who is a thalidomide victim, and she's got more energy and more courage to vindicate the rights of Irish children that have been neglected by all politicians in all parties. She has more get up and go and determination to do what the men of 1916 promised, to honour and respect the Irish children. Finola Cassidy, my sister. Before I commence the planned speech, I'm just picking up on references that we heard this morning. Dr. Mansura mentioned his family connection to the musical world in Dublin. It's nearly 25 years ago since I began to save what was then a very derelict, burnt out, ruthless building called the James Joyce House. But my only mission statement, if I may use that corporate term, was to recreate the dining room, recreate the dinner party, have interesting guests to dinner and see what turns up. And if a guest did not, so we used the menu that Joyce created: spiced beef, baked ham, pyramids of apples and oranges, stalks of celery in a vase, which were an aphrodisiac back in the day, because you only got it at Christmas. We learned from a visitor when she was growing up, you only got it in Dublin at Christmas. It was only served at Christmas, and now we know why, because apparently it was an aphrodisiac. But apart from recreating that meal, which has been a very joyous event, and I've done it in museums and private homes and warehouses and God knows where around the globe, we, through a German contact, tracked down the grandson of, or the granddaughter of Bartle D'Arcy, who was the tenor who sings the Lass of Aughrim in The Dead, in that plaintive voice. And we had to dinner his granddaughter and his great-granddaughter, and they came from Denton, Lancashire, with zero knowledge of his role in Joyce's literature and zero knowledge of his background. And from what Dr. Mansura said, we can date The Dead to 1903 through a number of connections, one of which is that there's a phrase where the one of the aunts is having an argument, largely with herself, about the bishop and the way he treats women and the way her sister was kicked out of the choir, and them whippersnappers that are going nowadays. And that was a direct reference to the Palestrina choir, or in Dublin it would be known as the Palestinian choir, in that great Dublin mix of words that always seem perfectly correct. And that's what I believe Joyce was playing with in any event. But the whippersnappers was a direct reference to the Palestrina choir. And of course, John McCormack was the first boy tenor in the Palestrina choir. And Joyce and McCormack had a particular complex relationship, perhaps. But the senior member of the men's choir in the Pro Cathedral had been Bartle D'Arcy, who features in The Dead. And apart from a short stint with the Doyle Cart in New York, where he was lead in the opening, and very shortly afterwards he was in the chorus. But apart from that international fame, it was his career as a hat maker that did him down, because somebody introduced manufactured hats, rendering the life of the hat maker redundant, and this wonderful tenor ends up anonymously in Denton, Lancashire, England, forgotten to Dublin. So what we used to do with a guest, if a guest didn't bring an unexpected guest, we would literally go out onto the street and drag in whoever was passing, and that never disappointed. And that's very much the tradition of keeping a seat at the table for the unexpected visitor, which, as I say, never disappointed. Why we're here today is directly because I did save the James Joyce House back in the day. That was the fulfillment of a teenage dream, and no more than that. I was going to do it myself. Sadly, I've lost it all now, so I had always seen my ownership of it as holding it for some future, but that's chalice has passed from me. But in terms of giving back, I decided I was going to build a global network of seats of learning, where I would give one brick from the rubble of the James Joyce House, and I would challenge complete strangers around the world to build a park bench to incorporate one brick from the James Joyce. And 63 seats as ambassadors for Joyce, as ambassadors for Dublin, as ambassadors for Ireland. And I'm chuffed because I pinched myself that anyone ever took this seriously. I have 2 seats in Australia. I have a seat in a school in Kuala Lumpur. I have a seat in the most violent slum parish of the Sacred Heart in New Jersey, Camden, New Jersey, home of Walt Whitman, who was an inspiration to Padraig Pearse. And next year we will unveil my seat at the tomb of Eliza Lynch, a woman from Charleville, County Cork, where Emma de Valera came from, in Asuncion, Paraguay. And we have seats in progress everywhere from Las Vegas to Antarctica to South Georgia Island to Geneva and to Loch Ray in Galway. And if anyone is interested in a seat, I'm the only one on the committee. And, we'll take it from there. But it's because I decided to do this, and it was a purely wacky idea. I was interviewed by the Pat Kenny show, as it were, of Australia, and they rang me and they said, we want to do an interview with you. And I said, fine, we'll do it from the library of the James Joyce House. And the library of the James Joyce had no books in it. And it was going to be at 9 o'clock at night, and there was no heating in the James Joyce House. So I said, we'll do it from my kitchen. But I didn't have time to tell them. The phone rings, and it says, now, Mr. Kilty, we're on an ad break, and we're going straight to you. So they come straight to me, and I'm fearful. My wife is going to come in the door. Honey, I'm home. The dog barks. It all falls apart. And he says, and now we're going live to the library of the James Joyce House in Dublin to speak with Brendan Kilty. So, you know, you burst his bubble, you've only a few seconds. So I decided I'd bite my lip, and thinking he'd move on. And he said, well, Brendan, tell our listeners, where are you? So I'm waiting for the kettle to boil, and I'm saying, well, as you said, I'm speaking to you live from the library of the James Joyce House in Dublin. And then he says, and tell our listeners, what can you see from the library of the James Joyce House? And I said, well, I'm looking out now at the River Liffey, Joyce's Anna Livia Pluribel. And beyond the River Liffey, what can you see? And I said, well, beyond the River Liffey, I'm looking north to the hill of Tara, where St. Patrick brought Chris back in the day. Not a lie, but it was dark. So the phone started hopping. I was milking cows in my parlour in Western Australia. Can I have a seat? And a great friend, Mary Dalmo, called me. She says, I'm the manager of a bookstore in Melbourne. Would I mind if they sponsored my seat? I pinch myself at this at every turn, in the grounds of the State Library of Melbourne. So I said, look, I'll consider it. Yeah. So 6 months later, I meet Mary's brother, Rick, in the dark at 6:30 in the morning. I'm just off a plane, and we're lifting a slab of Melbourne bluestone into position. And 3 million people tuned in that night, or that day, for the radio show for the unveiling of the seat. And Colm Tobin and I were sharing a platform again. Why, I don't know. But I discovered that they had a first edition of Ulysses in the library, so I got them to bring it out, and Colm Tobin read on my seat, which is in the style of a lectern from the monks of the Annals of the Four Masters. In the wind, he read from the first edition of Ulysses. So while I'm there, and I'm still wondering, what's happening, while that's happening, I see a statue in the library and in the grounds. Now, they've built my seat. A year later, they refused permission for a statue to the man who'd given the land on which the State Library was built. So, I suppose we got in before the guillotine. But who's this man? He's Sir Redmond Barry, Irish barrister from Ballyclaw, County Cork. He founded the museum, or the State Library, but we're a bit embarrassed. He's the trial judge who executed Ned Kelly. Do you want to see our Ned Kelly exhibition? So as an aside, that led directly to the acquisition of the cottage in County Tipperary, from which Ned Kelly's father stole 2 pigs. And I'm leading a project that hopefully in the next month to 6 weeks, we will reapply for planning permission. We had it, we lost it during the boom, to build the Global Irish Diaspora Centre in near Cashel, County Tipperary, where we are, because it's furthest from the coast, we're going to build a ship in Tipperary. The bow of the ship will be the theatre on the rake, modern interpretation of the building. The cottage, in the hold, we will rekindle the fire and collect stories from every townland in Ireland. And the stern of the ship will be probably the height of the stone structures outside here. And it'll be a monster replica of Ned Kelly's helmet. This is the one worn by Heath Ledger, given to me as a gift after they gave me the loan of 15 million worth of Ned Kelly national treasures, all because I gave Australia 1 brick. So if anyone has any investment ideas, give me a shout. But on the facade of that helmet, there'll be a climbing frame so that people can climb by the fingernails. It's my metaphor for the struggle of the emigrant to get to the top. And along the wall, the length of Grafton Street, we will have 60,000 names. We're calling it the Celebration Wall, to celebrate all of Ireland's diaspora. We heard a question to Dr. Mansur earlier about identity, am I typical or whatever. I go back to the 1916 proclamation, Irish men and Irish women. Says enough. Probably could be gender adapted, but we'll start with that position as the most specific consideration of Irish. So we are going to celebrate on a global basis, and the website only went live this morning. There's some material at the back. The phone will probably be functioning later on today. We are going to celebrate all of Ireland's global diaspora. And part of that project is we are going to collect a flame, an ember, from every county in Ireland where the ember has still been maintained, never gone out. We have one that's 14 generations where the flame has never gone cold. And we will mix those embers together in Tipperary in a cauldron built by the blacksmiths who made Robert Emmett's pikes. And as the 32 embers conflate, we will create, for the first time ever, the flame of Ireland. And within a couple of months, we will export that flame to the entire global Irish diaspora, whoever wants it. And a day will come, I promise you this, a day will come when the entire global Irish diaspora, including wannabe Irish, will be able to sit around, wherever they are in the world, we'll be able to sit around the same fire. That day will come, I promise you that. And because I gave a brick to Melbourne, they made me the international patron for the Bill of Human Rights campaign, and the former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser was the national patron. So the last time I gave a speech in a marquee, Malcolm and Brendan were doing a double act, talking to audiences such as yourselves about why Australia should have a human rights bill. And in the middle of all of that, I was asked to give a keynote speech on the 125th anniversary of Ned Kelly, which triggered all of this out. And I was waiting to get up to speak. There was a Jesuit, there was a singer, there was a human rights lawyer, and myself, wondering why am I here. But I got up to speak, and I was suddenly moved by the fact that I was under the trapdoor that a man fell through, hands tied behind his back, rope round his neck, hardly dead a few minutes later when his head was removed surgically so that his brain could be put in formalin, because it was the Victorian belief that criminals had a particular style of brain. So, and into a lime grave, while his mother was also a prisoner in the same prison. And I was quite moved by this, and I realized that a few weeks earlier in Dublin, I had saved the life of an asylum seeker. And I could say I'd saved the life in that I'd represented this asylum seeker, and we had prevented his deportation. Because if somebody is deported, he is deported to a country, and the Irish authorities telephone the country and say he'll be in on this flight, arriving at this time. And in a lot of circumstances, you can be assured that that person will disappear within an hour of arriving and is quite likely dead. But I didn't save his life, because it was the judge who gave me the order I was seeking to prevent the deportation. And that judge was Judge Eamon de Valera. And it struck me that that judge ought never to have been alive. He ought never to have been born, because his grandfather should have been executed. But for the fact that Eamon de Valera was not executed, the good, a couple of generations later, saved this man's life. It was part of that serendipity. Of course, I was completely wrong, because Judge de Valera's father had been born before 1916. So, but I was wrong in terms of the lineage, but the idea. So I began looking around the world at situations where people had cheated the hangman for diverse reasons, and looked at the good that they might have done in society subsequently. So we can talk about Eamon de Valera. We can talk whose surrender was taken by a man who a few weeks earlier had been a bank manager in Brighton. We can talk about whether it was his American nationality or whether he was just lucky that he surrendered last because he was out at an outpost and they hadn't processed him. But whatever the reason, he survived to be the next man standing, and he went on to become President of Ireland. But another man that history forgets who also cheated the hangman was W.T. Cosgrave, or the execution. And, you know, it's to the credit of both Dev and Cosgrave that at a time when TDs were still bringing revolvers to work with them in Dáil Éireann, that we had a peaceful handover of transition in the early 1930s. So Eamon de Valera obviously is one. He stayed in my father's house the night before he went to America, secreted in 1919, just sprung by Collins from Lincoln jail. And he complained that on the boat where he was a stowaway, the rats ate his sandwiches. Well, ladies and gentlemen, they were my grandmother's sandwiches. I take this very personally. But Dev survived, Cosgrave survived, so too did Constance Markievicz, who became the first woman elected to Parliament in Europe. A great achievement. Here I am, a man saying this is a great achievement for women. For God's sake, the Bible, I think, said some time back that everyone was meant to be equal. But in the mores of the day, that was a breakthrough moment for women all across Europe, for Constance Markievicz. But we can go back to the revolution of 1798, the United Irishmen riddled with spies. Most of them were arrested prior to Vinegar Hill. One of them was a man called Thomas Addis Emmet, who was the brother of Robert Emmet. We all know about Robert Emmet. Let no man write my epitaph till Ireland takes her place. There's a great scene where Leopold Bloom is farting in Ulysses, and he brings this to mind, this phrase. It's literary sacrilege. I won't bore you with it in present company, but I recommend it if you want to have a bit of a laugh yourself. But Robert Emmet's brother, Thomas Addis Emmet, was arrested, and by early 1801, 1802, he was a prisoner in Scotland. And the clamour was for his execution. He was not executed, and he was released on his word as a gentleman that he would never return to Ireland. 10 years later, death row exoneree, Thomas Addis Emmet, became the Attorney General of the state of New York. A long tradition that might see some justice meted out shortly in New York. But his grandson, also by the name of Thomas Addis Emmet, is buried in Glasnevin. And when I tripped over his headstone, I said, this is wrong, he should be in New York, but it was his grandson. And law and medicine were the two family professions. Thomas Addis Emmet, the medical man, is the father of plastic surgery. I'm not talking about cosmetic surgery, but plastic surgery. But he's also a man who developed a method for the safe delivery of breech birth presentations. So you can only imagine the hundreds and thousands of mothers and babies who have lived year after year because of the work of Thomas Addis Emmet, and because Thomas Addis Emmet, the grandfather, had not been executed. We go back to the foundation of America, inspired or energized by a man called Thomas Paine, who wrote a book, The Rights of Man and Common Sense, and that fed its way into the Declaration of Independence. He ultimately came back to England and he started saying that, basically saying that if you had a corrupt king, you're entitled to have a revolution. So William Pitt the Younger, I think, prosecuted him for seditious libel, for which the death penalty would have applied. He legged it to France, where in the middle of all of this, he is elected an MP in France. And in the terror that follows, he is sentenced to death as well. And the way the executions happened was that the executioners or the prison guards would go around and they'd put a chalk mark on the door. It's like in The Life of Brian, crucifixion, crucifixion, crucifixion. This would be execution, execution. But Paine at the time was so ill that in the heat they left the door open. So the prison guards put the mark on his door, but later on he closed his door and the mark was only visible from the inside and not visible from the outside. And that happenstance saved his life from execution, and Monroe, future president of America, brought him back to America. We go to 1915, the Battle of Waterloo, the great Irishman, the unsung hero of Irishmen, eclipsed by Daniel O'Connell, that great hero of Ireland, the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. He defeated Napoleon in 1915. In 1918, he was in Paris, and somebody attempted to assassinate him, to execute him. So in my book, I talk about extrajudicial and judicial killing. And this man's name was Cantillon. The prosecution for which Cantillon would have been executed, the prosecution failed because of a lack of evidence. They didn't have the bullet that Cantillon had fired. So that was the lack of evidence that saved Cantillon. And when Napoleon died, he left money in his will for Cantillon. But because Cantillon missed, and because the Duke of Wellington survived, he went on and he became Prime Minister of England. And for all the work that Daniel O'Connell had achieved in terms of the momentum towards Catholic emancipation, it was the action of the Duke of Wellington, who threatened to resign as Prime Minister if the King did not sign Catholic emancipation into law. So that would not have happened had the Duke of Wellington been executed. So that, to my mind, is a very good reason not to execute people. We can go into Europe, 1848, the Baden Republic. Germany hadn't begun to formulate itself, but there were beginnings of revolutions. And there was one revolution where the castle was surrounded, and eventually they surrendered to the Prussian army outside. But there were a number of Prussians inside, and they were certain to be executed. And one of them was a man called Karl Schulz. Carl Schutz was surrendering, and they were all walking to the parade room where the surrender, or parade yard where the surrender was to take place. And he remembered there was a sewer somewhere nearby. So himself and another chap ducked into the sewer, worked their way down the sewer, and wow, aren't we clever guys, were about to escape. And they did escape. They got out the other end of the sewer, and where did they land? Right in the middle of the Prussian army camp, surrounding it. So what do you do? The only thing you do is go back into the sewer. So they went back into the sewer, climbed all the way back up, hid and survived raids for a few days, climbed out the sewer again, and got away. And he became a general in the American Civil War, and he became the first German-born to be elected to the American Senate. Again, a very good reason not to execute somebody. We can go down to Mexico, and we can look at, in the early 20th century, a man called Diego Rivera. You might have heard of him, a bit of an artist, and Frida Kahlo. And as I understand it, both were sentenced to death in the various troubles they were having down there. And Diego Rivera worked in the same studio as Picasso in Paris, and Picasso plagiarized a significant amount of Diego Rivera's work. So a lot of what we, well, maybe we should execute the flies. There has to be an exception somewhere along the line. So that's an example why not to execute somebody. You have, throughout America, there are states where people are still executed. And if you think about it, this is final. There is no coming back from this mistake. As a lawyer, I can tell you the system of justice that we have in Ireland is not fit for purpose. It's broken. And don't take my word for that. A recent retired judge said it is not fit for purpose. The delays, the challenges, the system is creaking. It's the only system of justice we have, so we have to do our best with it, but it doesn't mean that mistakes aren't made. And once you execute somebody, there's no coming back from that mistake. In southern states of America in particular, there have been a great many people, generally not white European descendants, who have been processed by a system that is racially unfair. I was at a meeting some years ago with consultants in Washington, engineering consultants at the top of the consulting engineering profession. And they were talking about selling how many thousand hours here and how many thousand hours there. And it was a while into the conversation, they were selling prisons. These were privately built, privately contracted prisons. And if you build prisons, you need to feed them with people. And there are many cases of young children being fed into jails in America, not necessarily only in America, specifically to feed the paedophile desires of the owners and the judge in tandem. So just because someone is a judge doesn't mean they're necessarily a good judge or the right person to hold that position. But even if the system was perfect, we still have the risk of human frailty, the risk of lack of recall, the lack of, well, when I said that, I meant this. When I sent that invoice, what I meant to put on it was, you would know what you would see. But in some southern states, there was an expert with us called Dr. Death, who gave convincing expert evidence to say that, in my opinion, if this person is released again, if he is not executed, he will offend again. Shock, horror, execute. And I think there's something like 150 young men are probably dead because of the evidence that that man gave. You have a chap who was sentenced to death, appealed, succeeded, but was convicted again, and this time sentenced to life imprisonment. And 10 years in, he heard about this newfangled thing called DNA, and he insisted his lawyers get the DNA. And when I talk of DNA, I have to recognize Kieran Pryor, TED Talk, forensic specialist, And wait till you see his book next year. He should be up here speaking, not me, but Kieran Pryor. But the DNA was ultimately what demonstrated he could not have been anywhere near the scene and therefore was innocent. Had he been executed, his family would have been left with that shame, with that memory, with that horror, and no one would have known any different. And you have biased judges, you have biased juries, you have biased prosecutors, and you have people who want to get elected by getting prosecutions under the belt. All of that feeds in to a reason not to execute somebody. You all saw the movie Hannibal Lecter. It's coming up to lunch, I know. I'm going to have lunch with a friend, or it's coming up to lunch. Hannibal Lecter is based on a Mexican doctor who had a difference of opinion with his boyfriend and killed him and chopped him up. Understandable. If you go so far, the rest might become easy. But he was sentenced to death, and they never got around to executing him. 25 years later, there's a journalist doing a documentary about a different prisoner in the prison, notices this guy who he thought was, a visiting doctor, and he was impressed by the care he was giving to an ill prisoner. And then he learned that this man was a death row candidate. Trevino was ultimately released, having been sentenced to death because of the good work he had done. He was ultimately released and he returned to practice pro bono medicine in Mexico, even though he is the Hollywood model for Hannibal Lecter. So we see right throughout history, if we go to Japan, just as the Americans were approaching Japan in 1945, Germany surrendered. You had this awful prospect of the carnage that they had on the islands and the casualties of American soldiers and Japanese, a fight to the death. But there was a very unresolved issue within Japanese society: do we surrender or not? And some argued that we'll fight them to the very end and they'll have to kill 100 million or whatever. This was not an imaginative or theoretical argument. This was very real. Two stories out of Japan in World War II. One is in relation to a doctor from Castletown Bear, The Doctor and the Sword. Fantastic story. But he was a prisoner in Nagasaki. Beautiful city, I have to tell you. But he was a prisoner in Nagasaki, and they were digging a trench. And it was only when they saw a platform next to the trench being erected that they realized there was a stand for a machine gun. And they realized they were about to be machine gunned, and they realized they had just dug their own graves. And just before that could happen, the bomb fell, and the guys who were underground in their own graves survived the wave of the atomic wave while everything around them was incinerated. And then they gave aid as best they could to the victims of that bomb. At the same time, probably in the same week, the then Japanese ambassador, if you imagine this, they've built naval fleets, they've dominated Asia, they've built multiple, the world's biggest aircraft carriers. He got a telephone installed in his house the week before, at the end of the war. And young officers were determined not to surrender, and they were going to stage a coup to prevent the emperor surrendering and cordon off the emperor. So they set out to kill a number of the leading politicians and leading officers. And he got a phone call in his brand new, just imagine if your phone rings, hello. He gets a phone call in his brand new phone, get out, they're coming in. And as he ran out the door, his assassins were coming in to kill him. And a few days later, that's what I would call extrajudicial execution. A few days later, he convinced the emperor that Japan should surrender. Just imagine how many millions upon millions of lives were saved by cheating the hangman. If we go down to Africa, you will have examples, and I'm conscious of the time, you will have examples of people, the executioner coming once a month, and he's got a job lot, and he's exhausted at the end of the day, and he says, I've done enough. I'll come back next month. And the next guy's standing. Okay, he survives. It's that arbitrary. The method of killing someone officially is a very structured process. You've got to kill someone on foot of an order, and you've got to comply with the order. And if you don't comply with the order, and an order speaks on its face, you read it on its face. If you don't comply with the order, and you execute somebody wrongly, or not consistent with the order, that's actually murder. So there have been situations where they were about to hang somebody, and someone looked at the other, oh my God, this says he's to be shot. And they didn't have the right bullets, so he didn't shoot him. And then something happens. It could be an atomic bomb, it could be a revolution, it could be stop the executions in Dublin, it could be arbitrary and unexpected, and that person's life is saved. And a lot of those people in the southern states and in Africa would go on to become men of religion, or they're all men mainly, or that's a real Irish term, isn't it? They're all men mainly. In the main, they are men. And they go on in terms of religion. And even Coco Chanel had a lover who had murdered Rasputin. You might have heard of him. And he, because of his status, should have been executed. But you might see it happening in Crimea at the moment. If you can't execute someone, you promote them to the front. And you put them in the way of a random mishap. And this chap was sent to the Persian front rather than being executed. And while he was at the Persian front, all his relatives were killed in the revolution and executed. And he got out free. So how we survive is arbitrary. But if you look at the people who went on to have peaceful transition of power, who went on to be elected in a democracy, who went on to make medical inventions that have saved millions of lives, or who have politically been able to stop war. That, ladies and gentlemen, in my view, is a very good reason not to execute someone. And the final example I'll give you is, you've probably all heard of the story, the book Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe was written by a man called Daniel Defoe. Some would say plagiarized by Daniel Defoe, but for today's purposes, we'll say he wrote it. Daniel Defoe should have been executed in the Montmartre execution that failed in England. And the bloody assizes, most of the people involved were executed. For some bizarre reason, he wasn't executed. And if he wasn't executed, we would not have Robinson Crusoe as our childhood book story. There's also a view, when I talk about how imperfect the law is, there is also a view that juries would be keen to convict somebody, and a conviction would mean they would hang, and people would be convicted to be hanged so that jurymen may dine. Ladies and gentlemen, lunch is outside. Sorry, I can't. I beg your pardon. I can't hear you.
I'd like to make a comment. I really enjoyed what you said, and the horror of execution being brought before us to remind us of the right people have to live. Really, is absolutely marvellous. The protection on the child in the womb, the Irish child in the womb, was taken by a vote of the people, a shameful vote, 2018. There's no longer protection on the child in the womb. They don't have the right to life. And I think it's everybody has the right to life or none. And the child hasn't committed any crime. And over 30,000 of these young Irish children have been taken out of this world in the last few years. shamefully, I have to say. And God knows, or who knows, what they would have been in their time if they had lived. Sorry.
Anybody with a quick question or a comment? John.
Thanks very much. Yep. Thanks very much for your lecture. It was most interesting. You said, and I agree with you, that our legal system in Ireland, especially the court system, is broken. But, you know, I'd blame your own profession an awful lot for that, for the way you delay cases, etc., etc. And maybe you might comment on that. And going on to that, and just one other thing there in relation to
I can't
those
remember two things at one time, but go on anyway.
Yeah, well, no,
Try me.
the second one really is on the theme of your lecture. One of the most famous incidents, maybe, of what might have been was, I'm a Christian, and its founder, you know, was brought before the governor, Pontius Pilate. And Pilate, you know, somebody said he might have been a good man if he had made another decision. He didn't believe what the mob were shouting, that he was guilty of something. And he said, I see no sin, or I see no crime in him. And he wanted to release him, but he was afraid of the mob. So he turned him over, capital H, over to the mob. I don't know if you ever studied Pontius Pilate and the state of mind as to why he did what he did.
I was looking him up on Wikipedia last night. I can only answer your first question. I'm a senior counsel. I don't wear a watch. I don't keep a diary. I don't have a priority list, because everything gets done today, same day, turnaround service. Unless I have a court commitment, I have no appointments for tomorrow, because I know the phone will ring. But if you want to meet me, you do it today. So I'm not going to defend a system. Yes?
I found your theory very interesting, and I was really sucked in, to tell you the truth. What is your alternative to people who misbehave or who break the law in a big way?
Somebody asked the question, what's a typical Irish person? There's no such thing as a typical person. We are all different. But what I do, and I'm not a bleeding heart, if you do the crime, you should do the time. But if you're asking what the alternative is education, because there are so many people who are deprived of education, who are deprived of the proper familial support, and who actually don't understand. We are now in, I'm going to be criticized for this, but if you get the spirit of what I'm saying, we're in a godless era where the dominance of the church as a unit, and we can talk about how that came about with Archbishop Cullen, and it was a deliberate marketing plan to dominate the Irish people. But that was a deliberate strategy. Good or bad, there was a structure about it. There are a lot of people who no longer have structure. There are young, and again, mainly men, but not always, who are in prison. You'll see that they're largely from the same socio-economic groups, and they're probably from the same areas. And there's a culture of being abandoned, despite all the good that people are trying to do. There's a culture of being abandoned, and there's a definite culture of disconnect. And a lot of people who misbehave, let's say, in a typical middle-class eye, are people who actually don't know any better. I'm not giving a bleeding eye or a bleeding heart, but there are people who haven't had the supports. A friend of mine was institutionalized. He was institutionalized because his mother couldn't cope, and she thought she was doing him good. He's now in his early 50s. He told me he started living at the age of 40. He's been in jail, he's a reformed alcoholic, and he's a reformed drug abuser, and he helps people. But of the 30 in his class, I think only 4 are alive, and most of them by suicide. And that's the hidden lack of education and the lack of opportunity. So it's great to be able to come here and talk highfalutin stuff. It's the people who are at the coalface making the difference. Almost being a father figure, mother figure for one moment, move them in a direction to their benefit. I have a friend who's, I appeared in Australia. In Australia, you have what's called the stolen generation, where the Aboriginals were stolen from their mothers. And I was in court with a stolen chap. He got into trouble because I saw the letters. Dear doctor, I am 42, I've just arrived from Wales. I'm told I'm too old to have a child. I'd like 2 boys. If I can't have 2 boys, could I have 1 boy and a girl? And if I can't have a boy and a girl, 1 boy will do. That was her letter. The doctor, at the same time, is writing to this Aboriginal mother, your son is doing well, but the doctor says he's not able to come home yet. And he is given to this white family. He grows up thinking he's white. At the age of 10, he's brought into a room. Bruce, this is your mother. And there's this Aboriginal woman he never met, and he's abandoned. And he's to put a label on his shirt, and he goes on a bus, and he arrives in his Aboriginal camp, an alien, even though he's Aboriginal, because he comes from a different culture, and all he's doing is pining for his watch and his bicycle. And I said, how did you handle that? He says, well, I noticed the guys who kicked up got attention, so I started kicking up. So he spent most of his life in jail. Why? Because he thought this is how I might get love or attention. So it goes back to how we treat people with dignity and with respect from a very young age, I think.
Brendan, I was fascinated to hear your story of Cantillon taking a shot at Wellington. And it brought to mind a story I heard that when Wellington was Prime Minister and there was great pressure to give women the vote, Wellington wrote saying that he was opposed to giving women the vote because you couldn't be sure that you get the right result. So perhaps the suffragettes rather regretted that Cantillon missed.
In a largely female audience, I'm damned if I got that.